All right. The few of us here. Actually, I might get coffee first.
Let's be real.
Right. We're all out of sync.
We'll be fine. So quick reminder, this is the last one for the year, right? So next week is the bake sale, before and after, and then nope. The next week is the bake sale, and it didn't make sense to just do something on the 17th. So, yeah. So we might start. It depends on whether Ellen and I do something like right after Christmas. If I end up taking that Sunday off, which I probably won't. So if I'm not taking that Sunday off, we'll probably start right up again the first Sunday in January. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So, or I guess it would be the last Sunday in December, wouldn't it? 31st. Yeah. Okay.
It's New Year's Eve.
I'll be fine.
You'll be fine.
It's morning. Yeah, right. It's morning, not the next day. If the 31st was the Saturday, then we might have issues. Right? So we had friends in town. They came in on Thursday, but they're friends that I've talked about before. So it's my friends Ryan and Anna, who are both grads of Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Anna finished her doctorate 3 years ago and is now an adjunct professor at Lutheran Seminary. Well, she's not adjunct. She's a contracted but not tenured professor at Luther, teaching Hebrew Bible and other stuff. Ryan is currently finishing his doctorate, which has taken him 6 years, to do, which it does. So they've got a 3-year-old named Abigail who's adorable. So that's how it goes. But I always look forward to them visiting because I get to really nerd out on biblical stuff, and they're so intelligent and so well read and have studied Hebrew Bible from a doctorate perspective. And Ryan is Jewish, so I also get that perspective as well too, which is absolutely fascinating. So we were having some really great conversations late last night. we were talking Bible until about 12:30. Yeah, I don't know why I've got that in my hands. I pulled that out of my briefcase.
You win the day.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. My hands don't know or my brain doesn't know what my hands are doing. So one of the things I bounced off them, I was like, the next time you come out, you should come out for a Sunday so we could do a class about whatever, you pick the topic. Because they I dip my toes into Hebrew Bible scholarship, and they're fully immersed. So today we're still doing our debrief, but also this is kind of a free-for-all day. So whatever we want to talk about, we can talk about. One of the things that we were tossing around last week was this idea of heritage. And we started to delve into that, and then we went off on a tangent and came back. But this is really kind of the thing that, from our early Christian history studies, this is kind of the thing that I'm interested in, right? Is our heritage as Milwaukie Lutheran Church is made up of a bunch of things. It comes from the people that started the church, right? It comes from the people that are here, right? All the different backgrounds that we bring with us. But we're also connected to this very, very long history, this very, very long history of Christianity, right? Some places more tightly than not. But how do I put this? I think it would be unfortunate for us to not, at least in some manner, not necessarily, we use, here's often the word reclaim, right? But to understand who we were and how we got here, So we looked at, what did the church look like for these 300 years of formation? One of the things that I think is important to recognize is, we talked about the evolution of the church over that time period and how it evolved because of the context that it was in, a context of persecution, but also a context of really well, there was hierarchy, but there wasn't an institutional weight, which is one of the things that, our modern Christianity struggles with as well too, is that, churches are institutions, right? And there's baggage that comes with that. There's bureaucracy that comes with that. And these things aren't evil, they just are. So like Anna and Ryan and I were talking about, Anna is on the endorsement panel for Luther. So in the ELCA, there are 3 steps to becoming approved as a pastor. Well, there are 2 tracks, right? The first track is you need to get an education, right? So you start out with I don't know, things have probably changed, but originally when I went, you had to have a bachelor's. Didn't matter what in, right? So I had a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering, translated directly to theology, right? I'm kind of joking, kind of not. But then you get essentially what is a 4-year master's, right? Called a master's in divinity, okay? Or an MDiv for short. Okay? Go ahead.
I'm only going to say, I think that your bachelor is very important because too many bachelors going into seminary are oriented toward theology or have been. And then you repeat in seminary much of what you learned in your junior college. Or intensify that. But I think, for me, I only went through organic chemistry, but it was like, this is beyond me for one thing, but wondrously beyond me. And that appreciation that you pick up for valences, is so, I think, important, Jesse, that I think it's a great gift that you bring, being more broadly, or more STEM educated than the typical personality coming into our society.
One of the things that I realized is I definitely thought differently.
Yes.
Anna and Ryan and I were talking about this. So our other friends, Colin and Jen, right? So we were all a unit in seminary. Colin had a bachelor's degree in philosophy from, private, St. Olaf, from St. Olaf. He was an oldie, right? Colin came into seminary knowing everything. He knew everything, and he wanted to tell you why you were wrong about the things, So on one hand, he was insufferable. On the other hand, he was a great person to be around for somebody who had not read a single lick of theology in his entire lifetime, or philosophy for that matter. So, I just kind of stayed in his shadow for a while and learned what he had to do. But we thought differently, right? Very, very different, right? When we were posed with a theological question, right? Like, so one of the first classes that we took together was Systematics 1, so systematic theology. We talked a little bit about, but it's broken up into the three persons of the Trinity, right? So Creator, Redeemer, Sanctifier, God, Jesus, Holy Spirit is essentially. So the first one you take is number 1, creation, right? So there's a bunch of stuff there. And the way Colin would approach many of the questions that were posed to us by the professor were, which theologian has spoken about this? Or which book or writing can I refer to make my point? And my first thought was to engage it as if it's a scientific problem, right? Like, okay, well, how would I logic this out, right? And it was really fascinating when we talked to each other, is that Colin and I would often arrive at kind of like a similar idea, but we would come there from such different directions, right? Speaking of, I'll come back to this in a second.
And I think that's our heritage.
Yes.
That's why I bring this up, is that I think the church colleges have been given short shrift in that did a very good job for many of us of understanding that all liberal arts are holy.
Yeah.
That theology is not more holy than physics.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, I looked at the faculty at Concordia and Moorhead where we were at, who's showing up in chapel every day? The guy from the physics department's here every day. Who are the social science? So people in social sciences are not.
Why do they need it, right? They've already got it figured out, right?
Exactly. So,
Well, but yeah, so when we talk about heritage, especially our heritage as a church, right? Our heritage as Christians, our heritage as Lutherans or whatever, we tend to think just along that one track of like, what is the theological progress of our faith? But who we are is defined by the sum total of that as well, too, right? If you look at the history of the church, for a long time, the church was the sciences, right? Existed within, quote unquote, the Catholic Church. And even today, the Catholic Church and many others continue to privately fund education. They provide private schools. I mean, the tradition of the Jesuits is all about teaching. So there is this heritage, this thread of identity in us that is so much broader, right, than just missionaries or pastors. And this is also one of the things that I lament a little bit is that, again, we're limited by the sources that we have, right? So which are few and far between and not always super reliable in studying these early years of the church. One of the things that we don't really get a picture of is who the people are, right? We can speak about them in general terms, like we've said that, well, by and large, for a great portion of the history of that early church, it was not the upper class, it was not the elite, it was quote unquote, from a modern perspective, blue collar. And we watched how Christianity changed when you started having people who wrote books, right? Or arguments who were engaged in that, how that affected what the church was. If that had that great of effect in that little a time period, imagine how everything has affected the trajectory of where we're at now. And here's the thing. Can we call that the work of the Holy Spirit? Is that what's going on here?
I like to think so.
Yeah. I mean, to limit the work of the Holy Spirit to the things that happen on Sunday mornings or just within church buildings is really unfortunate. Because if the church is who, if the church is who the church is because of the people that are there and because of the people that, have walked that road of faith, then we are now who we are now because of everyone who has walked that road of faith, not just the people who have written theological treatises on it, right? So, yeah.
especially our moms.
Yes.
And their moms. And those folks who
Never made it to history.
Never got mentioned.
And this is a lot of it, there's a lot of what I'm talking about, is that the invisible hands that have shaped us. And sorry, I'm going to nerd out for just a second here. So we can look back at that 300 years of church history, and we can't maybe identify so many singular people, right? We have some and we don't have some. But we can kind of, based on the shape that the church takes, we can kind of estimate or develop a picture of who those people were. So like one of the things that we talked about is that women were absolutely involved in the early church, right? Despite the fact that by the time the church becomes an institution, it's only male leadership, right? We can see the shape of the women that formed those communities, right? For much of Christianity, right, women have not yet been allowed to be in leadership in the church. And yet we can see the shape of those people and how they affect it. It's not that we don't have stories. We've got great stories of mystics and monastics and all that stuff, right? But conversely, you can also wonder how would the shape of the church be different if there had been women in leadership all along, right? So there are positive things that we can point to that people have contributed to what we are now. But we can also point at, like, boy, how would things be different, right? If Lydia, or pick your favorite New Testament, if Mary Magdalene was allowed to be an apostle, capital A, right? And who was making those decisions? Let me go back to what I was talking about, because this is so there's 2 tracks. MDiv, you gotta get a degree, right? 4 years, 3rd-year internship. It's not that way anymore. But then the other was the approval process. So there were 3 stages to that. First one was entrance. So before you even get to go to seminary, well, you can go to seminary, but before you get on the track to be a pastor, you go through this. I've talked about it before, the torture weekend. No, you go. What I did, I don't know, Paul, what your entrance process looked like, but I had to go to basically a 3-day retreat where I got psychologically analyzed. I had to fill out a bunch of like personality profile stuff. I had to sit through 2 days of big group meetings where they ask you awkward questions like, "What's your favorite Bible verse?" And I didn't know the answer to that because I hadn't read much of the Bible at that point. And I said the Beatitudes, and then they asked me, "Well, which version of the Beatitudes?" And I didn't realize that there were 2, right? And so, anyways. But then, towards the end of that, you sit in front of a panel of people, and they essentially ask you the question, "Why do you want to do this?" Which is a really important question, right? If you're going into any, public office, your motivations are very, very important, right? Because if you're given power, which pastors have a lot of power over people. It's different than political power in some ways, it's similar in others. But we can do so much harm if we're allowed to. So that was, this process is really, really, really important, right? So they interview you, they ask you why you want to do it, right? I said, I'm going to help people. And then they said, okay, what else? Then, I think it is your 2nd year in seminary, you do endorsement, where you write a big long essay articulating your faith, and they decide whether it's Lutheran enough. And I'm not joking, okay? That really is a thing. And this is what Anna and I were talking about. And then the 3rd is approval, right? So that is your 4th year. You're almost done, paying this private tuition. You've sunk how many tens of thousands of dollars into this, and then they tell you whether or not all that education means you get to be a pastor. No spite there. But approval, in many ways, it's not necessarily a rubber stamp, but by the time you've been 4 years into this, you get a sense of whether or not it's a good fit for you, and so does your candidacy committee, right? I think you write another essay, but it's mainly around now articulating where you feel called to in ministry, articulating what you want to do with what you've been given, that kind of stuff. And it's helpful not just in whether or not you get to become a pastor, but it's helpful in deciding where you end up, right? What type of church you end up in. And so when you get placed, which is another thing entirely, that approval essay and interview is important to that. But this step,
what's the attrition rate?
the attrition rate,
Yeah. Say first year of graduation.
not super high. Well, the highest rate of attrition is on step 1. That's where most folk get weeded out. And it's really interesting because step 1, you get 2 or 3 chances. I think 3 chances. So if you get denied entrance, they'll give you the reasons why they denied you entrance, and say go and work on those things, and then you can come back and try again. And after the 3rd time, you can't go through entrance anymore. I think it's 3. That's where most folks get weeded out. And from the little that I know, generally the reasons you get weeded out aren't you're a sociopath, right? Those are few and far between. Not that they don't occur, but that thankfully is a minority. But if I had gone into entrance a year earlier, I'm not sure I would have made it. I matured a lot in my year of working at the chemical plant, right? I managed people. I was responsible for lots of money. It really affected me, and it made me more confident in who I was. If I had gone in a year earlier, I don't know. And that's a lot of the time what happens at entrance is that you've got people that are like, well, I'm going to be a pastor, and they don't really know what that means, right? They come into it, and they've got an image of pastoral leadership, which is formed from their experience as kids, but a lot of people might come to it and not have much experience at all, right? And that's not to say that if you didn't grow up in a Lutheran church, you can't become a Lutheran pastor, but a lot of times, the candidacy board will say to you, maybe you should understand what you're getting yourself into before you commit to this, right? So they'll say, take a year off, spend some time with a community, and then come back and visit us again. So this isn't a hard no. This is the one that I've always struggled with, because it really ends up being around this. Lutheran identity is a really funky thing, right? But the same is true of literally any denominational identity, right? Who are we? And this was important to me. We had a council retreat earlier this week on Tuesday. The church council got together, and we actually kind of asked this question, right? Historically speaking, who were we as a church? Who was Milwaukie Lutheran 60, 70 years ago, right? And who are we now? And how is that different? How is it similar? What are the things that we've carried with us? And what does it mean to be Lutheran in the 21st century? But also, what does it mean to be Christian in the 21st century in Portland, Oregon, right? And how can that shape our church? This is a question that I really struggle with, especially in a part of the country where when you tell people you're Lutheran, they ask you if that's Christian. Is that there's such an uphill battle. There's so much education, baseline education, that needs to be done in order to even have that conversation with folks, right? And it's kind of the question of is it worth it? Sometimes. But I wonder if I'm not approaching this from the wrong way, which is, what these last 9 or 10 weeks of study have done is that I wonder if understanding those things for me shouldn't first and foremost be valuable to me, right? Because here's the thing. Maybe we can't articulate the value of Lutheranism in the modern setting as an institution, but I would hope that we can articulate it in some ways as individuals. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be, why am I Lutheran? But I think a really important question that we should struggle with is, why do I go to church? Why am I Christian? And one of the things that came out of the council meeting that was shared for pretty much all of us is the reason I'm a Christian is because I was raised a Christian, right? Or not necessarily raised, but because I was handed that tradition as a child, okay? That doesn't carry as much weight as it did, We're here, most of our kids aren't, or our grandkids, and it's not even that they're not here, they're not in a faith institution. And it's tempting to say something along the lines of, well, basketball's on Sunday mornings, and it's taking our kids away from church. It's tempting to do that. Or, this is what's wrong with the world, and here are all the reasons. It's the internet and Facebook and blah, blah, blah. Don't get me wrong, some of those things are bad for different reasons. But, sorry, I'll get up in the pulpit soon. But I wonder where we've lost value in that, And perhaps it's because our heritage as people of faith has gotten intertwined with our cultural heritage, right? For Lutherans, we've got our Lefse cook-off, or Lefse cooking every year. We're primarily white of Western European or Scandinavian descent, and I don't know, maybe our kids just aren't interested in that kind of stuff.
I think part of it though is that if you pick up any publication these days, national newspaper or whatever, you can without hardly any trouble at all find people that are bemoaning the way their children spend their time. And it has to do with screen time.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I was a kid growing up in the 1950s, it was the same thing.
Yeah.
People, and I thinking about us kids listening to rock and roll music. So I think part of the answer to this, you know, is societal changes.
Yeah.
And you've got, you know, the older people like us, is kind of sitting here worrying about what's going to happen to these young folks. Well, I don't know. I mean, they might be better off and they might be worse off. But they are changing.
Yeah.
You know, and societal norms are changing. And I think that part of the falling away from religious observance by younger people is part of that.
Yeah.
But it's not that much different than, you know, a kid spending all his time playing video games.
Yeah.
Are the kids gonna be all right? The age-old question.
Are the kids going to be all right?
Yeah.
Is that a who?
Yeah, I enjoy conversations with all faiths
Yeah.
and all, and I usually, so, because I think communities of work.
Yeah.
I think that connection is really important. But I always say I go deep into Lutheranism because I was raised Lutheran. I was trained confirmation Lutheran. So I can't go deep into everything.
Yeah.
But I choose to go deep into who I am as a Lutheran.
Yeah.
But I enjoy friends and conversations and ask about their faith journey, their spiritual journey. And we talk about it, we don't compare, or at least I don't compare.
Yeah. Yeah, to not see them in competition with each other. And oh, go ahead, Joe.
Just in the competition, what's interesting, I was thinking about it when he was talking about Lutheran heritage. Currently, the big deal is, seems like in the noise, are you Calvinist or Arminian?
Really?
Yeah, and it's like, no.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to communicate because you have to go under those two categories, and Lutherans don't even address those categories in those terms. So people are just like, I don't get you. Right. These have to be your primary questions. If you're not doing that, that's not church.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
That's among people who care enough about theology to ask those questions.
Yes.
Which are few and far between here.
True that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Sorry, I have a bunch of ideas that I've been filtered through. Going back to what you were talking about, Matt. Yeah. Growing up, my grandma always blamed it on Nintendo. I don't think she knew what a Nintendo was, but she knew that kids played Nintendo, right? So we didn't get a Nintendo until we were like 17 or 18 because my parents were like, "We're not buying one for you. If you want it, you can earn money and buy it on your own," right? Which was fine. It was great. It's probably the reason we're halfway decent. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, and I remember. I had missed like 4 Sundays in a row for baseball, and my grandma called me and read me the riot act of like, "Why aren't you in church?" Which was not the right thing to do. I'll just say that, right? As a 13-year-old or 14-year-old or whatever I was at that time, I didn't feel like I was making a decision between baseball and church, right? And I didn't really have that concept, but she had obviously this sense of like, we're losing him. You know, he's spending too much on baseball, not enough time in church.
Baseball field.
Yeah, I can fight back too. You know. But that anxiety still exists, right? That never goes away, and it's not just about church either, right? You know, going back to that word heritage, is our children are different than we are, and our grandchildren are different than we are, and our children are raising our grandchildren different than we raised our kids, or we would raise our, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is always a pressure. You know, this is this change. Again, I go back to, and I wonder what it was like to be, you know, Christians in 250 AD or CE, sorry, and I wonder if they had those similar anxieties about their children, right? I don't know.
I don't think they did. I don't think kids really mattered all that much until they made it to the age of like, I guess you're gonna live.
Yeah.
Except that Jewish moms were different. I don't know when, but they were.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, matrilineal,
That's
yeah.
absolutely true.
In both ways.
In every way. But the reason I say that is you don't have those Jewish women again writing for us, or allowed to write, or even being taught to write about who they are, and yet they have been foundational, absolutely foundational. When you think about how the faith gets actually transmitted to children.
Yeah.
And they were worried about that before Jesus.
Well, imagine if you're a Jewish mom and your son became a Christian, right?
Yes.
Join that cult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the idea of raising children
Yeah.
is a very modern conception.
Yeah.
That wasn't an idea. There was obviously had children that you kept alive and this and that, the other thing, and they had to go off and like learn a trade or whatever they ended up doing. But the idea of like inculcating them with education and et cetera and so forth, that's a really modern concept.
Yeah, like well, and the expectations were different too. I mean, child mortality rates aside, children were wealth, especially in the ancient world, Who's gonna take over the farm when you're too old to run anymore and take care of you? Well, your kids, right? So you make sure you have enough of them so that there's at least one left, But at the same time, they were still human beings too, right? And I imagine that the way they felt about their children is very similar to how we feel about our children.
I believe that.
They're loved and valued and in different ways. Matt.
So we talk about heritage, and I'm looking around the room here, and I think it's fair to say every single one of us is descended from European people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so if you take yourself back to say the 17th century or the 18th century or the 19th century, and here were these people living in a society that really didn't change too much from generation to generation, just like you just pointed out. You're going to hand a farm off to your kid, right? Yeah. Then all of a sudden, one of those kids says to you one day, can you imagine being a parent in, say, 1850, and your children, your son and his wife say, we're going to America. And you say, swell. That's just what I had planned on.
But then I'm going to have to leave behind all my friends. And,
Yeah, but I think we have to look at the current term, despair.
Despair?
That's despair.
Oh, despair.
Because that's the real push for people leaving Europe, was the farm was inherited by who?
Yeah.
And who got left out?
Despair.
Despair. What are they going to do?
Yeah.
I have a cousin who's despair, and he's still bitter about it.
I'm glad I'm the firstborn. It had zero effect on my inheritance.
It has other issues though.
Yeah, it does. It does. Something that I don't think we give enough. Well, maybe we do, but something that is really important to understand as well too is just the rate of change as well. It's not to say that in the 17th century in Western Europe there wasn't significant change over the course of a lifetime, but for us, I mean, I don't think I need to belabor the point, but like if you track societal change, technological change, the things that we historically have looked at for markers of the changing society, we're dealing with this, right? The rate of change that we are culturally experiencing it's logarithmic. I mean, it really is, and it will continue to be for a while until the world ends and whatever. Because the environment.
I think it's valuable to say when that speed increased. And Paul Johnson is the historian that makes the point that the generation 1815, right after Napoleon got sent, right? The world takes off between 1815 and 1830. When you look at all of the things that happened in that 15-year period, it's like, my gosh, we've just changed everything from biblical times to postmodernism.
And guess what happens between 1850 and 1830? The First Great Awakening.
Yes.
Right. The spiritual reaction to the swiftly changing world. Right. And this is, I mean, let's keep talking about this. And I just kind of want to point this out, is that a few minutes ago, we were kind of talking about, lamenting our church is changing, it doesn't have the same value to our kids. And, a really important acknowledgement here is that how much this is all beyond our control, right? I mean, I feel like we should give more permission. Like, I don't have kids. I'm a pastor, right? So my dad obviously is back in 50-50 in terms of my brother doesn't go to church, but or do I count for like 60% since I went into the clergy, right? Or maybe I count as less. I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm being really snarky, right? But I don't know how many of you carry grief or anxiety about the fact that your children aren't people of faith. And I think it's important to kind of like forgive ourselves a little bit that it really is beyond our control. And in a lot of ways, giving your child permission to live their faith the way that it's meaningful to them, I think is something that's very important. Even if that means that you can't visibly understand what their faith looks like. Because the alternative is awful, where you try and enforce your spirituality on them so that they look like you, right? And this is, talking about heritage. This has been heritage for us in the past, right? Definitely my grandmother's generation, right? And it wasn't even just about whether or not you were going to be Christian or even Lutheran. It's which branch, which is it the Norwegian Lutheran Church? We've talked about how petty, well, from a modern perspective, petty, but very important arguments, these things were. And I think one of the reasons that we have seen, besides rapidly changing culture and technology and society, I think one of the reasons is this is a backlash, to that enforcement of religion, right? If you are required to be of a specific faith or denomination simply because you were born into it, I think what we're witnessing now is kind of like that rubber band snapping, We now live in a world where our parents can't control us financially the way that they used to, right? One of the consequences of that is our kids don't need to do what we tell them to do. Once they've got jobs and homes and all that stuff, or not, right? You still can't tell them what to do in the way that 200 years ago, John Jr. worked on John's farm. Whether John Jr. wanted to be a farmer or an astronaut, well, there wouldn't have been any astronauts, but you get the point. Maybe he wanted to be a theater star, but that option wasn't available to him, right? This is what makes the good movies and stories, right? This is the ones that are doing that.
So this important distinction between, every human being has faith, or they don't get up in the morning.
Yeah.
You kill yourself the night before.
Yeah.
And or hope you die tonight or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I can go darker. Just to say that everybody has faith in something.
Yeah.
In someone, and in themselves in some sense, and has a reason for being that really exceeds, oh gosh, I gotta taste that new dish tomorrow morning. Although maybe that's their faith, that's okay too. It's better than the alternative. But I think that's a broad enough question for us to appreciate the human beings whose hearts are beating all around us, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, in our theology, our faith says that all those human beings could be Jesus.
Yeah.
And we have to have the eyes of Jesus to see Jesus in them.
Yeah.
And so I look at a couple of my kids, and so I am loving their hearts. I am loving their minds. I'm loving their struggle in life. I'm loving their ethics. I'm loving their sense of responsibility. I'm loving all of that.
Yeah.
The fact that I'm not sure about, again, scripture, liturgy, prayer, the existence of a deity, a personal deity necessarily. Those are things I try to incorporate in this primary thing that I do with our kids, which I think you were aiming at when you said that we have a little control.
Yeah.
We do have a little control, but I think one of the important things is to say that the institution of the church does not compete with Star Wars. as a metaphor for faith. And that's where we have to be clear as a church that all the ways that faith is expressed in our culture, through our media, especially through our press, through our academic institutions, through our corporations, they all have a faith. We need to define again how that faith is different than our heritage faith, because it is. And we have much to commend to those folks if we can talk with them, realizing that they have perhaps a non-cross-centric faith.
Yeah.
At the very least, or maybe they don't even have a Jewish faith. Is profound. And for me, I think we have to go back to our Jewish roots when we talk about heritage, instead of going back to Martin.
Yeah.
Or Augustine. We really need to go much further back. If we can't make sense of the Exodus for us today, I think we have nothing to give to people in terms of a heritage. That's why I don't look at that whole thing. And so, you wrote up Matthew 25 there, and I thought, well, exactly, right? How many people are doing that stuff that don't call themselves Christians? Yeah. How many people are doing that stuff that don't call themselves European? How many Japanese are doing that wonderfully? Yeah. Right? Or Malaysians. Yeah. And to catch people up, right? Matthew 25 was the text for last week, was it? Yeah. Right? And it's, the two lines, makes us uncomfortable, should, of, sheep and goat, right hand and left hand. And, the right hand is the one where they're asking, the king, why am I in this line? And the king says to them, well, when I was in prison, you visited me. When I was hungry, you fed me, et cetera, et cetera. Well, when did we do that to you? I've never met you before. Right? That's kind of an important idea there. But when you took care of the least of these, you did it to me. This is one of the most challenging, in many ways, texts in all of Scripture for me. Challenging in terms of, you get to the sheep and the goat stuff, and it's like, oh, it makes my guts feel bad, like the eternal darkness, et cetera, et cetera. We talked about that last week. But also challenging from the standpoint of, we're sitting here from a quote-unquote perspective of faith, and maybe asking why others don't share that faith. Right? And Paul articulated something really important, which is that you don't wake up in the morning if you don't have faith. And what does that look like? So at our council retreat, we storyboarded a little bit. We brainstormed a little bit about what that means to us. I asked the question a little bit more. But one of the things that came out of it is purpose, right? There's meaning to my life. There's meaning to what I do other than just existing, right? And do our children have purpose in the world? Yeah, and sometimes in a way that they can articulate much more clearly than we do. Because we kind of wrap all this stuff up into this one idea, right? Our church articulates their purpose, church articulates the way we view the world, all these things. If you don't have that big framework to work with, you have to be a little bit more succinct or articulate, right? Which is that, if for your children who are kind and generous and see the problems in the world around them and want to do something different, it doesn't get carried in church, right? It doesn't get carried in that bigger identity. It's something that they are choosing to do. And they're choosing to do it not because somebody held a text over their head that says, if you don't do it, you go to hell. They're choosing to do it because that's their faith, right? And it would be interesting to hear them articulate what that means to them, right? But they have faith in humanity, faith in themselves, faith in the goodness of human beings, on and on and on and on and on. It is amazing how very compatible with the identity of Christ that is, right? So when Christ says, well, when you took care of the least of these, you were doing it to me, that's not just a metaphor. In some ways, again, Paul articulated seeing Christ in those around us. It's literal, right? Is that one of our great theological claims is that in many ways we are inseparable from Christ, right? In a big sense, but also in the sense of that
we all carry the spark of the divine in us in one form or another, right? And the ability to see that spark in others is vital. That, and I would say this too, right? Other concept here, sorry, these two are really important, right? And this isn't my favorite word, especially in the era of influencers. But I think you pick your better word here, but this is a really important thing for us to think about as well too, is that it used to be the way that you maintained the social coherency of your family, right? In other words, they look like you, believe like you, talk like you, because that means they're good. And I'm overselling this a little bit. It was more from a control mindset, right? And that's not to say that your grandparents or your great-grandparents were bad people. Not, but that was the way we thought about the world. That's the way that the church functioned, right? If you don't agree with everything, well, not everything, but if you cross the line between orthodoxy and heresy, you're out, and we're the ones that control the keys to the gates of heaven. So better do what we say, type thing. This is a much different idea.
Or attractiveness, maybe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, but it's more in terms of how we think of our role. Is that, you are have been one of the primary influences on your children. And not just your children, right? We don't have to limit it to that. You are an influence on your family, your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, right? Going back to earlier, I'll use the word confidence, but having a confidence in what this is about to you will allow you to do this. Because if you're able to articulate a question which many of you may have not, well, maybe you have. I shouldn't shortchange you. But again, many of us, myself included, are here because this is where we came from, right? Like, I probably wouldn't be an ELCA pastor if I wasn't raised in an ELCA church, and if I hadn't encountered a positive example of clergy in my life. And it just so happens that my positive example of clergy was a pastor from India, from the Church of God in India, right? But it was within a Lutheran setting, whatever. But I probably, most likely, I wouldn't be here were it not for that, right? If I were not raised in the church, I probably, most likely, statistically speaking, wouldn't be in church at all. There are always exceptions, right? There are always exceptions, and it's fun to point out, well, but this person wasn't in the church, and they eventually chose Jesus, and that's great. Well, yeah, it is great. But statistically speaking, most of us wouldn't be here were it not for the fact that we were born into some form of faith. Now, some of us are transfers, right? We were raised Presbyterian or Catholic or, Disciples of Christ or whatever, and we wander our way into this setting, and we may wander our way to a different setting at some point, But that isn't a given anymore, right? That isn't a given anymore. And so we potentially never ask the question of, were it not for those things, right? Why am I here? What is important about this? And, the things we articulated on Tuesday were like community, right? You all know each other, well, mostly, but, your community. You consider each other friends or at least close acquaintances. Most of you don't fight too much, which has been kind of nice serving this church. I haven't had to break up too many fistfights, which I don't know if that's a thing other pastors have to do, but, I'm being a little bit snarky, but community, right? So this is your social community in a lot of ways as well. You don't just come here for the church aspect of it. You come here because you enjoy the people that are here, right? And so, what about your kids? Who's their community? Because they have community. If they have faith, they have community, right? And maybe, and sometimes it's not ideal. Like we all reach points in our life where we feel alone because our community has moved away, or we've moved away from a community, right? And life has those ups and downs, but your kids have community, right? What are the other things about this experience, right? Again, why church? Why Christianity?
Any community that holds together over time has to make sense sense of reality and transmit that in a way that people can hold on to a large extent, I think. In other words, does my view of reality make sense? Does my, not just view, but does my existence in reality make sense? Rather than, oh, that's a nice group.
Yeah.
You know, gosh, I mean, the Masonic order is kind of weird, but they're a lot of nice guys. I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
they seem less weird if your dad was a Mason.
yeah, very much less weird. And so this thing that has emerged, though, is these forms of, I'm going to call it gnosis, right? Knowledge.
Yeah. Knowing.
That don't come from the pastor, don't come
Yeah.
from the Pope, don't come from the scriptures. These other forms of knowing, and so the Enlightenment is not something that the church has done well integrating. You know, I mean, for instance, I take evolution extremely seriously as the means by which God has created the universe.
And continues to
A
create.
lot of people cannot even begin to articulate that, and that doesn't help me.
Yeah.
You can't articulate it.
Yeah.
When they just say, "Oh, God made everything," I go, "Who's God?"
Yeah.
You know, but we have done a really poor job there.
Yeah.
We've done a really poor job of selling. Let's say I'm gonna put it this way: exuberant marriage. Sex is just not been good, not been a thing we've talked about. A lot of people just they see us as being anti-sex, when some of us are decidedly not anti-sex.
Yeah.
And we need to articulate that. But as an institution, I think we haven't articulated World War I to people. I mean, there is a circular firing squad of Christianity in the heart of Europe that we've never recovered from, and kids have looked at the institution and said that's not just a failure; it's morally corrupt. It's outrageously terrible. Nazism coming from this heritage is extremely problematic, and we haven't articulated that the way Bonhoeffer has.
Yeah.
So, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So we're up against, well, you know this. I just want to say this in my church here today, that we have failed miserably. A lot of it's not in our control, but we failed miserably to bring the light of Christ to a dark world.
Yeah.
Institution.
Yeah.
And so that failure has been mostly not enough effort, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
Just assuming that other people would do it. At one point, I had the assumption that the Jesuits would take care of it. And actually, as it turns out, they're about as influential as anybody has ever been in a century of educating other human beings. It's been amazingly, right? Influential. So I compare our influence with like Jesuit influence. I think that shrinking core of Jesuits is still way more powerful than even if our church were expanding.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, that's one way.
You know, I think about what I think about faith and where we exist in today's society. Sometimes I go back and think about the last place where I was at a job, which is a place called Western Rivers Conservancy, and what they were all about was protecting rivers. And the way they did that is that they would identify critical pieces of property that were not being used to protect rivers, and they would buy them. And in fact, I have a little slogan, something like, if you see something that needs to be done, go buy it. And so they would go out and buy this property. So the people that work there, almost none of them actually belonged to a church. There were 2 Lutherans there, me and one other guy. But almost all the rest of them did not. But they had faith in that doing these, what you would think is being routine real estate transactions, they were doing something extremely worthwhile. And Laura, I think you probably run into this too, with your clientele that are, in the agriculture business, but at the same time, they're doing things that benefit humanity and benefit
I agree. And I would even argue that kind of faith has doctrine, right? I mean, the doctrine in this case is how do we protect these bodies of water? We buy the property, and there might be others who care about the rivers as much as they do, but differ in doctrine or how you go about doing that stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I've got 2 minutes. I really enjoyed these past, I don't remember how many weeks it's been when we started this. I enjoyed it because I got to relearn things that I had forgotten, reading back to Gonzalez and doing the peripheral work, I also enjoyed it because of the conversations that we have in here about this stuff. I can read this stuff on my own, and it's still interesting, but it's not as much fun to me as being able to talk about it, to bounce it off of, off of each other. So, going forward, whatever we study next, I'm just putting it out there. This is my goal, is to be able to have these kinds of talks, which maybe it's studying the Bible, etc. Anyways, one last thought.
Well, that's part of our heritage too, is
Yes.
reading in community, which is distinct
Yes.
from others.
Yes. Yeah. Even though I might present myself that way, this way sometimes, I'm not the expert here, right? I'm educated and informed, and I can do research, but you all have as much expertise in tangential things as I do. This is what we were talking about in the beginning. You bring valuable contributions here because it doesn't exist in the White Tower of Seminary. Okay, last thought, and then we'll break until January. This is a very important duality here, and it's one that the early church struggled with very greatly, right? And you could put other things in here, empire, right? Military, whatever. Okay. It's also something that comes up repeatedly today, and the way that it's often articulated is as if there is Christian culture, and then there's the other cultures, right? And the two things are oil and water, right? And so much of what church looks like in the modern world is trying to create things that are solely Christian, right? Where you consume Christian things, trademark. So you listen to Christian music and Christian radio and Christian news, and and you buy from Christians, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? And it creates a false conflict, right? Which is this idea that it is culture, right? The bubble outside versus Christ. However, this actually is a real conflict, and it's what we study essentially, is that who the church is, in all of its many forms, are probably actually more like 90% culture and 10% Christ, right? And I'm just making a number up. But the point is that what our church looks like in our practices and our gatherings, etc., is heavily influenced by where our ancestors came from, where their ancestors came from, what they did, what your family did growing up. We gathered here probably because our families have shared similar practices. It's how, in a denominational world, you gravitate toward the things that are like you. Right? That's not bad. That's not bad. We just got done talking about heritage. Obviously, that's not bad. And we need to also understand that our cultural expression of Christianity is not the whole picture. Right? That at the end of the day, what we're seeking to do is to bear this image, imperfectly at best. And in order to do this, it requires a level of receptiveness and openness that seems to be disappearing in our modern world, which is, and many of you articulated this, today, which is, how do I see faith in other people? How do I see the meaning that my children and my grandchildren use as their guideposts for life? And having a vision of the world wherein you are constantly seeking to see the amazing things that Christ is doing or Christ is present in with a level of curiosity, I would advocate is the most faithful thing we can do right now. Because of this rate of change, if we could just step back for a second and let go of our anxiety about our institutions and our buildings and just say, I'm really curious. The world is changing so fast. I wonder what God's up to out there. I wonder what God's doing in their life, that they are serving on a board of governing streams, right, or governing water. I wonder what they're doing. That every week they go down to the waterfront and hand out sandwiches, even though they've never been a part of a church. I wonder what drives my kids to be kind and compassionate and care for the people around them, right? So Christ and curiosity. These are the things that I think we need to carry with us going forward. All right, thanks, folks. I'll see you in 10 minutes, and I will also see you in a month.